Thank you very much for accepting this invitation to Michael O'Hurley, who is a political analyst, diplomatic political analyst, very knowledgeable about Ukraine, and Professor Kieran Hallen of sociology in UCD. Welcome to the debate. None of us, and I'm sure you agree, ever thought that we would have a war in Europe in 21st century. But we have one thanks to Mr. Vladimir Putin, who decided to settle his account, so to speak, militarily in Ukraine, or with Ukraine. A war of attrition, thousands of deaths, 14 million destabilized Ukrainians. We are witness also, for all intents and purposes, of war by proxy between the West and Russia, whose end game is difficult to predict. In every major event like this war, there is room for dialectical considerations. We know that the world hosts two different and opposite ideologies, that of the West and that of the East, mainly Russia. But ideologies, in my opinion, have their points of view and agendas. It is when these points of view from either side are ignored that conflicts ensue. And it is clear that Putin's point of view was that NATO was expanding far too close to Russia doorstep, and that this had to be stopped. After all, let's remember what Kennedy did when the Russians placed ballistic missiles in Cuba. From an objective point of view, and not to excuse Mr. Putin's campaign for 1 minute, I personally think that we in the West are too used to think that we are right and the others are wrong, and that Western powers are angels, and keep forgetting, though, that the interventionistic policy of the United States, for example, has been responsible for the destabilization of the entire Middle East. Besides, in my opinion, there are two issues with this war. Firstly, without wishing to diminish the patriotic determination of the Ukrainians in fighting the Russians, the continuous supply of weapons from the West have given them the self-confidence that they will beat Putin and get him backing. Possibly it's a pie in the sky, in my opinion. Secondly, the packages of economic sanctions delivered in dribs and drabs have proven to be ineffective as they have lacked totality. What is your take on this? Would you like to start here, Kieran?
Well, I am in agreement with a lot of what you said there, Concetto. So first of all, from my point of view, the war was launched by Putin in a completely unjustified manner. I listened to his early speech where he denounces the idea that Ukraine has any right to self-determination. I think he stands in the tradition of Russian Tsarism, what's often called Great Russian Chauvinism, and indeed the same tradition of, even though he would deny it, from the Tsar to Joseph Stalin, sort of great Russian chauvinism that has always been involved in the oppression of Ukraine. So I have absolutely no problem in condemning what he's doing. Secondly, yes, I do agree with you. It's also a proxy war, and it's a war being fought by NATO to expand itself. The US Defense Secretary has now said the objective of the NATO is to weaken Russia permanently. So in my view, it's an imperial conflict between two power blocks. And I think that NATO's intervention is singularly unhelpful. I don't know why NATO exists. It was set up in 1947. It's not an alliance of democratic countries. It included in the beginning, for example, Portugal, which was then run by a fascist dictatorship. It included Greece, which was run by the military generals for a period. It is essentially an anti-communist alliance. But and this is where I don't fully agree with you. I don't think it's a clash between ideologies anymore. I mean, after all, Russia is a capitalist society. Tony Blair welcomes Vladimir Putin when he became prime minister. Putin cooperated with the West for a period during the in various counterinsurgency activities. So I think it's really a clash between two empires. And I also agree that the decision by the United States to send in an incredible 50 billion worth of both military and non-military equipment to the Ukraine is really throwing oil on the flames and will lead to greater bloodshed and greater loss of Ukrainian, Russian lives in this terrible conflict.
Yes, okay, well then, Michael, your reaction.
I take a different view. Had the 50 billion or whatever amount of money that's been provided by the proverbial West to Ukraine been provided over the last 20 years as it should have been, no one would be batting an eye. We need to keep it in context. Ukraine has been restrained from arming and defending itself as any other internationally recognized state has a right to do. Do I believe that it's a clash between empires? To a large degree, Kieran's right. But the other problem of this is that we're dealing with Vladimir Putin. He is a cold warrior. He's a former KGB agent. Like John Wayne, he sees everything in black and white, good and bad, east and west. The reason NATO exists is specifically because of characters like Vladimir Putin. He had an opportunity to participate with NATO to ensure that Russia had the security guarantees that it needed or wanted. And instead, he decided to go a different direction, poison people throughout the world, murder people on European soil, commit heinous acts of human rights abuses in Syria, in the Central African Republic, and now in Ukraine. This war is 8 years old. It's not since February 24th. It's 8 years old. If it's a failure of diplomacy, it is a failure of European leaders to recognize that the longer they stayed tied to supporting the Russian economy, which is basically a country with a large gas station, if they couldn't sell petrochemicals and fossil fuels, the Russian economy would be nothing. So dealing with Russia over the last 20 years, failing to become fossil fuel independent, to embrace green energy and go their own way, has put Russia in a position that it should not be in today.
Okay.
Do I think the U.S. is pushing the problem? I think that Blinken's statement about weakening Russia is unfortunate, but it's the reality. And we cannot allow the international rule of law to be mediated by someone who sees the world as his for the taking.
Very good. Now, I want to retract my definition of ideologies, etc. Yes, we call them the way you like, but there are two empires with different way of acting, if you like. So, but now, in essence, now, what do you think is going to happen? Because how is this war going to end? This is the fascinating point.
Well, before I come to that, I mean, I'm glad that Michael recognizes that it's a clash between two empires. But given the anti-colonial tradition of Ireland, I don't think we should assume that there's good empires and bad empires. It's as simple as that. And when it comes to the American empire, I mean, I don't see a great difference. I mean, people may not be as familiar with the town of Fallujah as they are Mariupol, but exactly the same thing happened. It was literally flattened to the ground. People were murdered. There was a terrible occupation of Iraq, mainly conducted by American forces, that led to the death, according to the Lancet, of over 1 million people. Over 1 million people. Same thing happened in Afghanistan. I could go on. But the idea that there's somehow this is a war between democracy and autocracy, well, you've got a basic problem. How do you explain why the West is in alliance with Saudi Arabia? How do you explain, for example, that Saudi Arabia, after the sanctions, because of the sanctions, has just seen its wealth increase by $23 billion, which it will now use to invade Yemen and murder and maim. It has already killed over 400,000 lives. So, or rather 400,000 people have lost their lives in Yemen. So I don't accept there are good empires and bad empires. These are two brutal imperialist powers fighting a proxy war. There's also the question of the Ukrainian have a right to defend themselves, but that unfortunately is being overlaid by this proxy war. How do I think it's going to end? Well, that's a very difficult question. How do I hope it would end? I hope it would end by the overthrow of Putin, by the Russian anti-war movement, which, by the way, 15,000 people have been locked up for quite serious offenses. I hope there's a major crisis in Russia that leads to the overthrow of Putin. I don't think the sanctions help in that. I think the sanctions have the opposite effect, just like they had in Iran. In other words, that if you impose sanctions on people, it allows a thug like Putin to rally people around the national flag and say our country is being attacked. And unfortunately, that is what's been happening. So I would hope the war ends by the emergence of an anti-war movement, particularly in Russia, but also I think by people becoming more aware of the crimes of the Western Empire. Might lead to a certain cynicism about its war aims.
Yes, yes. Some people suggest that, in fact, there could be a revolt within Russia, but this is a long finger type of stuff. Michael, a final word about how do you think this war is going to end?
I don't think it's going to end anytime soon. I am struck by the parallel between the American Civil War between 1861 and 1865 and Russia's war in Ukraine. In 1861, you had advanced military weapons like rifling and bullets that made them fire straighter and faster. They were still using 18th century military tactics. Here we have Russian military troops conducting military operations on a Soviet-style assault, massing troops and going at it in a blunt manner. And their tactics no longer meet the weapons. But beyond all of that, we're talking about basic humanity. Kieran is right. The United States efforts over the last 20 years in Iraq, Afghanistan, have been an abject failure and regrettable policies. That doesn't excuse what Vladimir Putin is doing. And we can't wait around hoping that there'll be good Nazis who depose Hitler. We have to make sure that Ukraine wins this war. Putin has surprised people before. He's changed the constitution to stay in power. And around him are many Russians who agree with him, like Lavrov. And even Navalny, who is the sometimes hero of the West, has expressed his belief that Ukrainians are not an independent nation. So how is this going to end? I think it's going to be a war of attrition, in which Russia, which now controls, according to Zelensky, 20% of Ukraine, continues this bludgeon front in which they pour troops against Ukrainians and experience high losses in equipment and personnel, and along the way commit atrocious war crimes. And Ukraine, which is going to have fewer casualties and more precise weapons, which one will end? It becomes a matter of staying power. This is a boxing match that's going to go brutal, and it's going to go right down to the decision and to the wire. The question is will the West remain behind Ukraine? It has a moral responsibility to do so, and I do think that Russia is nothing but an authoritarian government. Its economy is not a free and open economy. The number of oligarchs whose money is controlled by Putin proves that. We owe Western civilization a chance for freedom. And Europe's neglect of Ukraine for the past 20 to 30 years, as well as Georgia and Moldova, Montenegro, Europe should be a robust exercise in democracy, not economy. And we owe it to Ukraine to give them a fighting chance to determine their own future. And if we don't do that here, China will understand that and do the same in the East, in Taiwan. And the US needs to learn its lesson too and withdraw from the Middle East.
Michael, thank you very much. And thank you, Kieran.